right, well, welcome everyone. This is an event sponsored by the Dana Foundation Career Network in Neuroscience and Society. My name is Francis Shen. I'm a law professor who works at the intersection of law and ethics and neuroscience, neurotechnology, and I direct the Career Network. Thank you to the Dana Foundation for funding this effort, and I will put this in the chat for the students and trainees and postdocs and mid-career professionals here. neuroxcareers.org, where you can see other interviews and other events, and where there are a lot of resources related to careers at neuroscience and society. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Efraín Torres. We met a number of years ago in the Center for Magnetic Resonance Research. I still remember our first meeting. It was in one of those little corridor kind of a meeting there, and Dr. Garwood, who I see on the call, introduced us and said, Francis, you got to talk to my new PhD student. And since then, it's just been really wonderful to see your career blossom in so many ways. I would say that it is not unexpected, only in the sense that you're immensely talented and you've got so many cool things you can do. But I think for many in this call, it's surprising, and we're going to hear more about that journey. So brief introduction, and I'll keep it brief because we're going to hear from you about how you got there. Dr. Torres holds a PhD in biomedical engineering from the University of Minnesota, serves as the CEO and co-founder of the neurotech startup Adialante, and in development of neurotech, and I can say this as someone who knows him, thinks deeply about ethical issues, especially accessibility and how cutting-edge technology can be used for all. We're going to hear his story, coming as a first-generation American in the South Side of Chicago, and now running with his PhD as a CEO. So I think with that, we'll just start. And the first question, which I hope you'll give us a rich answer to, is how did you go from the South Side of Chicago, not the son of neuroscientist, to a PhD in neuroscience, and now to a CEO of a company? Kind of take us through that journey, and I'll turn it over to you. And thank you for being here. It's wonderful to see you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. I also remember the first time we met. I remember how cold it was that day. So one of the things I remember as well. Yeah, I mean, a little bit about me. It's certainly been a interesting and at times difficult journey. So my name is Efraín Torres. I'm a first generation American. So my parents immigrated over from Mexico when they were teenagers, and they're very hardworking people, but they didn't have the opportunities to get highly educated when they were in Mexico. So neither of my parents graduated from middle school. And so it's really interesting sometimes discussing my work with my parents, because I have to, I'm a bilingual in Spanish. My first language is actually Spanish, but I oftentimes have to figure out the proper technical term in English, then translate it in Spanish, but then explain the entire science of it from the beginning to my parents. So sometimes it's interesting discussing my work with them, but it's been a great journey coming from the background that I come from. So I have two brothers, and my although I am first generation, I do want to always give credit and be grateful to my oldest brother. He was the first to go to college in my entire extended family, and he was really the one who set the example for me. So I, for a very young age, knew that I was going to go to college. I had no idea what it was. I had, I would be a middle schooler. They keep telling me I'm going to college. I don't know what that is. And my parents didn't really know what it was. And I was always very interested in science, and always, to an annoying degree, for my middle school teachers, I was a very big watcher of National Geographic Channel, and I would be extremely frustrated with my teachers that they did not know, for example, what dark matter was. So I would consistently berate them in class about that, and thinking they knew those answers. So I was always very curious towards science and understanding that. And actually, a big moment for me was where I went to high school. So I got the chance I got a scholarship, and I was able to go to a better school in downtown Chicago. I love my background, I love my community, but the middle school that I went to wasn't very resource heavy. There was times where we didn't have actually a teacher. Sometimes it would be a lunch lady like my mom just playing videos for us because the teachers' turnover was very high. And so my parents really tried to find a better school for me, except they're, very costly. So I was fortunate to get a scholarship and go to St. Ignatius College Prep in downtown Chicago. And I would say that was probably one of the most pivotal moments of my life because I went to school in Little Village, which is a community in Southside Chicago, about 99% Hispanic, probably 90% Mexican. So I kind of thought the Mexican culture was the US culture and that everyone around me, everyone in the world, because you're young, right? It hears shootings, has friends who are in gangs, maybe sees violence. It's kind of a normal thing when you're a kid, as even though it shouldn't be normal. But then when I went to high school, most of my classmates were actually from very affluent areas. And that was where it was a huge cultural shock for me because I was like, oh, wait, none of this is normal at all. Now it's like, oh, none of this shouldn't be normal. It shouldn't be normal for my community to lack the resources to medicine, to lack the resources to education, to not have the opportunities to better themselves. And for me, high school was a very sometimes tumultuous, sometimes you know difficult time for me because I was kind of trying to do well in class while dealing with almost a little bit of anger of like, why is my community the one kind of suffering from all these inequities when all of my classmates around me get to go home to nice neighborhoods and nice houses, and they don't get to see any of this while I'm here kind of trying to do my best. So high school was an interesting time for me because I had to kind of process that in addition to try to do well in classes. And it was a very formative year for me, and that's kind of when I really decided from a young age that I really wanted to do something about it. So when I talk about the fast forward to now, Adelante and the goals that I had for these companies is something that I've been thinking about for probably 15 years, despite the fact that I'm still in my mid to late 20s. It's been something that I've been thinking about since I was in high school, where I wanted to do something. And it was my oldest brother, again, who encouraged me and said, to never forget where I came from and never forget the reason why I'm going to pursue all these other goals later on. Because it's the whole reason why I've done everything that I've done and will continue to work very hard, kind of try to bring back to my community. And then, during high school, I actually had no idea what I was going to do for college. Again, I didn't know what college was. And how I became an engineer is a very interesting story because I knew I wanted to solve a problem for my community, which is the access to medical technology. And at the time I had a science teacher, and I was kind of talking to her like, what do I do? And she said, well, engineers solve problems. You should become an engineer. And that was basically the entire reason why I became an engineer. And I had no idea what I signed up for either. I was woefully unprepared. I I think I took algebra 2. I never took pre-calc or calculus in high school. As kind of as simple as it sounds, I didn't know you needed to know math for engineering because no one in my family is an engineer. So it's like, I don't know what to take. I'm just going to take these classes. So going from that and then going to college in Milwaukee, it was very much catch up and just catch up as much as you can because I attended Marquette University and it was basically similar story. Everyone around me, oh, they took pre-calc, they took calc A, they took calc B, they took physics 1, physics 2. They, their parents maybe are in STEM, their brothers are in STEM. They kind of know the language, and now here I am again, trying to figure out how to learn these classes while also trying to figure out how do I interact with this broader community that is clearly not me. And it's very subtle cues sometimes because it's for me, and I grew up in an apartment with a very large family. In high school, it was actually up to 8 people at times. because my brother had a kid when he was very young, and my nephew, and now all the conversations are about a lot of people from Minnesota actually, lake houses, skiing, skating, going on vacation, and they would have the same reaction when I would speak with them, which is, "What, you don't know how to ski? What, you don't have a lake house? What, you don't know how to do this? You don't know how to do that?" And it was basically the same thing every single day, and it was interesting going through all of that, and it's to an extent it still happens sometimes. So being Latino in entrepreneurship, and also when I was in academia, and it bugged me a little bit at first, but when it comes to kind of dealing with those things, I've learned to kind of embrace and be very proud of where I come from, because yes, I am from a little village. I am, my dad is a janitor, my mom's a lunch lady, but I never, I would say I've never have been ashamed of that. So even if people have those reactions at me, I kind of joke at them sometimes. Well, do you know how to speak Spanish natively, or have you watched these telenovelas like me growing up, or do you know what a concha is, or do you know what tamales are? So now you kind of learn how to balance it out. But in college, it was, for me, when I started, I had the same goal, which is develop new technology. And I my first lecture I still remember was by Dr. Scott Beardsley, who became my PI for 4 years. Talked about neurotechnology, EEG at the time, and he mentioned how it's interesting how sometimes big life decisions are just based off a single sentence. But he said something similar to what my professor in high school said. My professor in high school said, if you want to solve problems, be an engineer. My professor in college said during my freshman year, if you want to develop new technology, become a researcher, because they do cutting edge work. So it was done then, I guess, at that one moment. I spoke to him after class, and I joined his lab, where I focused on EEG research for 4 years. I was fortunate to do a couple posters, publish a small paper, and also that's where I kind of got introduced more into imaging and imaging at large. And in my junior year, I began working with Dr. Schmeida, who focuses on MRI specifically. And that's when I was first well, actually, there was two things going on. I'm going to take a step back. So engineering, obviously, and research was a big part of my undergrad. But another very large part of my undergrad, and arguably what it has led to for this startup, is I was in this program called Engineering Leadership, which was a 3-year program where they teach you how to become a leader and how to develop and lead companies, for example, startups. And early on, during my junior year, I was introduced to this term called disruptive technology. And just for pure definition, a disruptive technology is a technology that fundamentally shifts everything. So for example, an iPhone. Before the iPhone existed, everyone probably had dial-ups, press buttons, there was no touchscreen, there was nothing like that. The iPhone comes up, it changes the entire definition of what a phone is. And now you have this whole new thing of whole new implications, a whole new reach. And when I learned that, that's when I had the click in my head of this is exactly what I want to do. I want to develop disruptive technologies, specifically in medicine, to bring it back to my community. I still remember the lecture. It was the exact moment where I went to my dorm afterwards, and I discussed it with my friends, and I was like, this is exactly what I want to do for the rest of my life. Disruptive technology and bring it back to my community. And so I spoke to my advisor, and I said, okay, well, what do I have to do to develop disruptive technology? And I specifically focused on MRI at the time with Dr. Schmeida at the Medical College of Wisconsin. And she said, well, if you want to learn about MRI and you want to build MRI systems, you have to get a PhD. So I was like, okay, so I guess I'm getting a PhD so I can learn about MRI systems and develop new technology. And I was fortunate in my undergraduate years to also get a fellowship that allowed me to really have my pick in terms of schools. And that's actually where I came across Dr. Garwood's work, who I believe is on the call. So my senior year, I did like a whole vet of many different labs across the country because I was like, basically, which lab is developing the craziest technology in the world? Is the question that I was asking. So which tech could be disruptive so that I could help in the development, and then after I graduate, go make a company and commercialize it and bring it back to my community and other communities at large. And there was actually only a couple labs that kind of peeked out to me. It's interesting being in the working group, Francis, because two of them are Dr. Rosen and Dr. Garwood. And so I spoke to Dr. Garwood actually my junior year before I even started applying in the summer, and then senior year. And then I he is a very creative mind and brilliant, and comes up with the craziest ideas that end up working, which is exactly what disruptive innovation is. You come up with a crazy idea that no one thought could work, and it ends up working and becoming a big deal. So I then came to his lab, worked very hard, had a, actually I actually had a TBI. Francis, you probably remember this. I had a TBI, so it's probably funny story. I had a TBI, so I worked on Francis' working group NIH project as a research associate. We had just agreed to it, and I showed it, but I had just had a fairly bad concussion actually from a bike wreck, and I joined the meeting still, and I vaguely remember how disoriented I was.
I remember we told you to get off the meeting.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
go rest.
yeah. It was very interesting. Couple of months. I was kind of not capable of doing very simple things like, oh, I mean, I was fine walking around eating, but like cognitively, it was just kind of like a weird time. But I had that, and so knowing what I wanted to do in my PhDs, what's accelerated me, I would say. Actually, what I would say has accelerated me from the get-go is since high school, I've known what I've wanted to do, which is help my community. Now I've chosen engineering to be the vehicle of that. Engineering and developing neurotechnology, that's really the things that I've determined is the best mechanisms for impact. And that's why in my graduate year, I apologize for my here in the background, but during my graduate years, in addition to the graduate work, I've actually in parallel have continued things like entrepreneurship training, continued being a heavy reader in non-technical work, more leadership, more speaking, storytelling, different things that you're going to need to actually commercialize this technology that is not technical. Because once it's out of the lab and you're pitching to investors and you're trying to recruit people, as much as it sucks sometimes, it's kind of not about the technology anymore. And I want it to be, and many of our engineers want it to be, but when you're speaking of people, you have to really cut back on the technical terms you're talking. They don't know what a Beanock grading coil is. And frankly, sometimes they get overwhelmed and don't want to talk to you because you mentioned something highly technical. And my graduate years was all about learning how to be that for the future, and also trying to progress in my PhD and develop technology. And we were fortunate to, I would say, be fairly successful in developing the technology that we did for our company, in which we've licensed it exclusively from Minnesota and are now on our way. So hopefully that's a rich answer. And I'm happy to expand on anything along the way. I try to condense my life in 10 minutes, so hopefully that was good.
Well, I want to move primarily to discussion. These events are primarily a vehicle for discussion, but I do want to ask you to expand on just a couple of points. One is, in retrospect, in the story you've told us, it's this amazing success story, but I'm sure there were moments of struggle and doubt and I don't know what else. I'm wondering if there's any one particular moment or set of moments or type of moment where, although you had the plan in mind, it either didn't seem like it was going to happen or you weren't quite sure what path to take. Many of the students in our career network, I think, face crossroads, and it's difficult, again, to know exactly, as you say, you knew you wanted to help your community, but how? And then even once you kind of figure out how you want to do it, you've mentioned how out of place at times you felt. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about some of the struggle and how, maybe ongoing struggle, and how you have found strategies to deal with that.
Yeah, so in terms, on the concept of struggle, absolutely, that's especially if you're a minority in STEM, pushing through, trying to get, into new networks. You don't usually don't have family members that can guide you. Don't, for even for entrepreneurship, usually there's this thing called a family and friends round, where your first round is you go talk to I've actually been at a talk where they say this is when you go talk to your rich uncle. And I'm like, well, what if my uncle is not rich? It's like, then what? Then what's my next step? But so has there been struggle? And then certainly, absolutely, it's kind of a guarantee in everything. What I've been asked this question by a couple of people now, and what I usually tell them is, you really have to kind of know who you are first before you kind of begin going down career goals that really satisfy what you want to do. Knowing what you want to do is reliant on knowing, first of all, what your interests are, second of all, what your strengths are, and third of all, what your end goal should be or is. And it's okay if all of those are moving targets. Sometimes it's just about taking a dive and seeing what this field looks like to me. Engineering, when I first dived into it, I had the interest in the end goal, but it was whether I go electrical, whether I go mechanical, computer, software. There's many different areas that I kind of looked around, and I just kind of tailored it to what I found. Well, two things: what I found the most interesting, and what I think I would do my best at. Because you have to kind of think about your inherent strengths and weaknesses. And for example, I know I'm not I'm good enough in math to get a PhD in it, but I'm by no means a mathematician. So when it came to my work, I kind of knew that about me, having struggled heavily in some of those high order math classes in undergrad and in grad school, and kind of tried to pursue and dabble into more technical but not heavy math courses.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I would always say, everything's a moving target, and it really takes. Actually, this is, I would say, if I were to give some advice, I would always suggest some sort of periods of heavy reflection. Whether it's journaling, whether it's after your classes are done, whether it's after an internship, really trying to reflect and think about what you enjoyed, what you didn't enjoy, where you struggled in, where you found really nice, where you just found like the work was just fun, and but you can't find those moments if you don't reflect about them, because then you forget about them, and then you kind of just if you don't kind of decide where you're going, then life will just take you somewhere, and then you'll just be there.
So I've got two more questions. They're they're on totally different topics. The first is about mentoring, and I see in this room, it's kind of cool. We have both mentees, students, but I also see some mentors around, and I'd put myself in that category. So I'm wondering, the two-part question is, what have you found as important in the mentors you've had, and what would you encourage others to look for, in a mentor or advocate, even more than mentor? And also, do you have any advice for us who are mentoring students and advising students and advocating for students who don't have rich uncles and who didn't go, and they're like, as you said, it's like, why would you? Who would know that you need math or engineering unless somebody tells you, right? I mean, it's just sort of, what is a PhD in neuroengineering? What's a PhD to begin with, and how long does it take me? So, two-part question. For the students, what should they look for in a mentor and an advocate? And for us on the mentoring side, what can we do better? What's worked? What's not worked? I mean, anything in the mentoring realm?
Yeah, so on mentoring, finding mentors is an absolute must, in all avenues. I still have mentors in entrepreneurship, in leadership, and personal mentors, and the reason that is because first of all, you never truly know. You never know. The point I'm trying to say is we always have this one lens of reality. You, Francis, from your upbringing and your connections, me from my upbringing and my connections. I find mentorship and also teammates very helpful because they bring in a whole new perspective, and usually they're a bit wiser and can help you guide and just avoid mistakes. So first of all, before I get into what makes a good mentor, I want to really emphasize the importance of mentors, both informal and formal. And in terms of what makes a good mentor, I would argue it's someone who's humble, who when you speak with them and you're vulnerable maybe about how hard life is sometimes, or how hard school is, or the career, they don't they appreciate your vulnerability when it comes to talking about sensitive topics and listen actively. And so I would say being humble is a big aspect of that, because if there's someone who has a massive ego, they might not care about your vulnerabilities, and in a moment of weakness might push you to do something, change your career directly when you really didn't want to, for example, or maybe just not be helpful on a day that you really just needed to be helped. So finding someone who is humble, I think, is a very good aspect in terms of how you find that. I think it's pretty easy sometimes to weed out who's a very egotistical. You can kind of gather that from discussion sometimes, but I would say that's a very important um, aspect. And the second one is, the great mentors that I've had in my life are always people that I could tell sincerely want to help me. So if I bug them, they never push me off, or they always answer my text, or they always pick up the phone. Or if I walk in on the random Tuesday afternoon when they probably have a million things to do, they won't rush me. They'll let me sit down. They'll let me talk to them, and so that's another aspect that is very important. And when it comes to also finding a mentor, you're going to find them informally and formally. Formally, PI student. There's a formal structure there. But don't be afraid during a networking event asking to get coffee with someone who you might think can help you in some way, because usually people do want to be helpful. And even if they can't, they might point you towards someone else. And even if they ignore you, then you're ignored, and then you try another one. Because all it takes is one person to just really change your life. And it doesn't matter if maybe that one person at that networking event didn't respond to your email. Maybe the next one will, or don't be afraid to just follow up with people on some things as well. And then on hopefully that was good enough answer. And then on the second point for mentors to mentees, especially to kind of underrepresented groups like myself, I would double down on the openness. There's always an instinctual reaction that we can't really control sometimes. Like it's like, oh, well, that kind of, oh, that's where you're from, or whatever. But after that moment, kind of dampening that reaction to people's backgrounds and asking them questions about where they're from. Most of the questions that I get aren't about my culture or my people. It's about, did you see a shooting in Chicago? And I'm like, well, yeah, I did. I was in the south side of Chicago. But my neighborhood is also a vibrant community that if you walk around, you see gorgeous murals, especially if you walk in around there in Mexican Independence Day. There's this massive parade of people that are dancing around, and it's kind of this whole great thing. So asking people, just in conversation, a little bit about, and from a genuine sense of curiosity. My co-founder and good friend and future best man at my wedding, Parker, he's a good example of this. He's from Eden Prairie, Minnesota, which you know that area, Francis, kind of the opposite of South Side Chicago sometimes. Mm-hmm. And we're great friends, but we're from polar opposite backgrounds. And that's because anytime my background has come up in conversation, he's always approached it from a genuine curiosity and a genuine want to understand. Like, oh, tell me, oh, how is it like? What's your traditions? Or like, if I bring him some food that he's never tasted, he'll be the first to try it, things like that. I've never felt the odd one out. It's someone who instead just wants to actually know a little bit about who I am. So that I would say that's definitely a point. And then another point is definitely, as hard as it is sometimes, not making assumptions about what they are, what is or is not simple. Like to your point of math, right? Like it sounds very dumb to say like, oh, you needed to be surprised that you needed math or engineering. Everyone knows that. But the thing is, not everyone knows that. Like my parents didn't know that, my brothers didn't know that. Probably that's and guess what? The majority of people probably in the world that means don't know that. Because although my experience in academia in an entrepreneurship is largely the minority. Like if you look at the stats of Latino founders, it's like 2% or 3%, some crazy low number. There are millions of people who share my experience. So we are not a rarity. So it's not so we're not an oddity, I should say. Instead, we're just someone that you just happen to never know because probably in the circles of maybe academia or other areas, it's largely more people like you than me.
So last question, this is actually picking up on, and then we'll open it up to all questions. And there was a question here, and it dovetails with the one I want to ask. The question is, can you talk about your neurotech startup and what kind of work you do? And so I'd like to piggyback on that. Can you talk about your neurotech startup, the kind of work you do, and do you ever experience a tension between running a company that needs to make a profit to survive and what you said your original goal was since high school to help your community? That is that ever intention? But tell us a little bit also first about what's your company, how does it work, what are you trying to do, both from a tech but also business perspective, and then maybe you can finish up with that neuroethics, and then we'll open it up to anyone who wants to jump in.
Yeah. So I'm the CEO of Adelante. So Adelante is a small medical device neuro scanner company. We're a small team, so 4 people. We're in the midst of our seed fundraising round, and kind of explain that a little bit. Most startups go through a series of financing rounds where you raise a lot of money or a little money, depending on the case. And it's usually seed, followed by Series A, Series B, Series C, Series D, and the rest is kind of alphabetical. So we're very much in the early stages, the beginning stages of making a team, of growing a company, and actually making a product. And the big thing that differentiates us from our competitors and other companies is we are very focused not only on affordability, but also on clinical value. So one of the big things that kind of peeves me sometimes is when I've heard things in certain talks in conferences is that, these scanners might be low resolution, but it's okay for these communities because they don't have anything. And that's fine. And that's great. And I'm glad they have access to something. But the point that we make is that the technology as a whole should be cheaper so that they also get access to the good quality, much better images that, the very wealthy communities have access to. And so our technology is very radically different. So it comes from Dr. McGarwo's group. And our approach to MRI is fundamentally different in how we build scanners. And so that allows us to get some cost savings without dropping the clinical value of the scanner. And so that's a little bit about the company and a little bit about the mission. And again, the mission is all about developing affordable and clinically valuable scanners so that we can get these scanners in communities across the world. And then to your second question, Francis, absolutely. There is tension all over the place. So when you take an investor's money and grant money, you have even sometimes informal, but sometimes formal, an imperative to give them a check later on that's 10 times that amount. And so I have to be very strategic with who I take money from and who I don't take money from. We've actually been fortunate to be in a position where we've said no to more people than have said no to us when it comes to investment. And that's because we're very careful from who we take the dollars from, because we want to reduce that tension as much as possible. Because do I want to make a scanner that my parents' village in Mexico could get access to? Absolutely. That's my goal. But it's going to take an incredible amount of patience and an incredible amount of strategic financing and strategic growth. Because at the end of the day, my imperative as CEO is to make sure I can pay my employees first and foremost. And that, whether I like it or not, not everyone is willing to work at a low wage, and not, I'm not to blame them. If some people have families, of course they can't work at a low wage, crazy hours for this crazy idea, right? That has to be kind of put to my side. I have to raise enough money to pay my team well and to keep them well supported while we work towards our mission. So is there tension? Absolutely. And there's always going to be tension because, my investors, I have to fight this assumption off every single day, Francis. And happens probably multiple times a week. They say things like, "Oh, so you're probably going to be acquired by GE in like a couple of years, right?" Like, "Oh, so you don't actually want to be CEO, right? So when are you going to bring in another CEO?" That happens. It's probably happened over 50 times. Like,
Huh.
"Oh, Efraín, so when are you going to hire another CEO to replace you? And then you're going to be an engineer, and then they can make the decisions." And I'm like, well, the answer is not no, and that's not going to happen. And so I'm not going to take your money. So there's always tension, and I have to be really strategic because I can't avoid certain things. Like as a medical device company, I have to fundraise money, and I have to fundraise a lot of money. The average medical device company like mine has to fundraise over $50 million, and
Five
the
zero
average
50.
burn, yeah, 50, and the average burn rate of a class 2 medical device company, which is what we are, class 2 designating the level of regulation, the average amount of money that's burned per day, if you average it out, is $55,000 per day. And that's because of how much money you have to pay to the FDA, how much money you have to pay to your engineers, to your sales team. So I'm going to have to raise a lot of money. And so I'm going to have to take checks from people that probably, even if they're clear to me on the front side, might be thinking, "Oh, he's not serious about bringing this product to market. We're going to sell his company in a couple of years so that I can get my check back," right? So it has to be almost chess-like in the strategy. So
Mhm.
I could probably talk like an hour on that, so I'll end it
Yeah.
there.
Well,
But
no, that's great
overwhelmingly, yes.
perspective. And I appreciate your candor. In the interest of candor, what I'm going to do now is thank Dr. Torres. I'm going to stop the recording, but we're not going to stop the session. We're going to open it up because often questions are individual and personal, and that way we won't record this. So thank you, Dr. Torres. Let me stop the recording.